For as long as we've been making video games, we've also been attempting to work around the limitations of the medium. Maybe the hardware isn't yet powerful enough to match our concept, or there may not be an existing tool we need to implement a mechanic. And although a console's hardware power may seem to have strict upper limits, these barriers can be bent and broken with smart design. In this analysis, we'll take a look at the clever ways that game designers have circumvented limitation while designing a game. We'll see that most limitations occur as part of the hardware, and that developers can make clever use of visuals, sound, and data storage to maximize a console's performance for their game. We'll also discuss the importance of limitation and whether it actually presents a true obstacle or merely the illusion of one. Lastly, we'll explore difficulty conceptually to argue that limitations are not always hardware-based, but can also arise from a game's design. Regarding game design, you might sometimes hear it sarcastically said that it's not a bug, it's a feature. The truth is, many features of games actually start out as bugs that somehow inspire the creator to adopt them into the game. For example, the increasing difficulty of Space Invaders was actually an accident. Game creator Tomohiro Nishikado found that the speed of the game was directly affected by the amount of remaining enemies, because the processor wasn't powerful enough. A lot of enemies meant a slower game, but as enemies were cleared, the processor strain became lessened and the game sped up. Rather than somehow adjust the game to compensate, this bug was left in the form of progressing difficulty. The original Metal Gear also shows an early example of such a problem. Originally for the MSX, a Microsoft console that preceded the NES, the game was intended to be an action title, but given the limited number of on-screen objects possible, the game was instead designed with familiar stealth mechanics that the series is known for today. Without their backs to the wall, the developers would not have opted for this changing game tone, but it proved successful in continuing the franchise all the way to the present day. Sometimes, the feature and bug argument doesn't show itself in a game's final release, because it has been cleverly hidden by the developers. Later generations of game consoles were much more powerful than the NES, but they still had serious limitations. The main difference here is that the relative power of newer consoles allowed more room for storytelling and atmosphere, which meant that these limitations could be incorporated into the game to help set the game's tone. The PlayStation title Silent Hill used its fog in a creative way. The game's world is covered in fog that obscures most of the landscape in front of the player, which adds to the tension and atmosphere of the game. But it was actually added because of the console's limited ability to show objects far away from the player, commonly called the draw distance. The same technique was widely used in the 5th generation of gaming, for games like Turok and Super Mario 64. These games, however, didn't attempt to justify the obvious visual limitation. A low draw distance can lead to popping and flickering, so fog was added to Silent Hill, killing two birds with one stone. Distance was no longer a problem, and the game became even more claustrophobic and tense. Instead of trying to hide the console's limitations, the developers highlighted them by working them into the narrative. Using a conspicuous graphical change to tell part of a game's story is actually more frequently done than you might realize. For example, the original Deus Ex, released in 2000, took place in New York, but didn't have the Twin Towers in the city's skyline, because of memory limitations. The in-game explanation for this is that the towers were destroyed by a terrorist attack. Just like Silent Hill's fog, we're set up to recognize that something is out of place, but the change can be explained satisfactorily. It just needs to be done within the game's story. This particular memory issue was solved while also adding a bit of lore to the game, and it coincidentally foreshadowed events that would occur in real life a year later. Since we're on the topic of the 5th gaming generation, let's take a look at how intelligent developers can solve nearly any problem with enough dedication and time. The development of the PlayStation title Crash Bandicoot has been retold in Longform by the game's creators. It's an incredibly in-depth and interesting read, and I highly recommend it. The creators at Naughty Dog used the motto, "Bite off more than we could chew, then figure out some crazy complicated way to make it work." This is already an unusual philosophy because the hardware limits of most consoles were fairly well defined at this point. You only had so many pixels and so many inputs, and a standard tug of war with the console's specs would only get you so far before flaws started to show. Naughty Dog employed all sorts of techniques for maximizing the console's efficiency when running the game, and the hardware dictated many of the design choices. Why does Crash have gloves, spots on his back, and a light-colored chest? Resolution, bad lighting models, and low polygon counts. Those small additions let you quickly determine what part and rotation of Crash you were looking at based on color. If you saw spots, it was his back. Yellowish-orange was the front. As the hands and arms crossed the body during a run, the orange tended to blend into muck, but your eyes tracked the black gloves as they crossed Crash's body, and your mind filled in the rest. Instead of using the standard skeletal weight system to animate Crash, the creators went through 6 different iterations of vertex animation compression. This helped create the cartoony, over-the-top visuals that Crash was known for, but the PlayStation wasn't exactly capable of running smoothly with this configuration. Those 6 iterations of vertex animation were made with an end goal of successfully storing the location of every vertex in every frame. The game's levels might require between 8 and 128 megabytes of memory, but the PlayStation only had 2 megabytes available. The creators went out of their way to create compression tools that would compress larger levels down to a tenth of their size, and then created a tool called DLE to code how each level's parts should be stitched together in sequence. They also created a brand new programming language just to code the gameplay. As a result of this extensive dedication, Crash's developers became more familiar with the PlayStation's hardware than even developers within Sony, who couldn't replicate the game's relative complexity. Each level in the game contains a large number of crates that break up the action and allow you to play with Crash's abilities. These crates were actually a very late addition to the game, and they solved the problem of long, relatively empty stretches of a level's landscape. Their very low polygon count was perfect for the efficient use of computational power, and they were so fun that they became a core component of the gameplay. There's so much more we could talk about here, but if you can spare a few minutes to read the original article, you'll find it fascinating. Before we leave this topic, there's one more example that exemplifies all that we've discussed so far. In 1999, id Software's Quake 3 was released. John Carmack was the lead programmer for this, and most of the company's other titles, and when the source code to the game was released in 2005, a very significant piece of code was revealed. Although Quake 3 used a particular piece of code to great success, nobody really knows how or by whom it was first created, although it may have existed as far back as 1991. The function of this code is rather simple. It estimates the value of 1 over the square root of x, where x can be whatever number you want. It's called the inverse square root. So why is this significant? When Quake 3 was being developed, expressions like this that involved division were handled by floating point operation, which involves converting numbers with decimal points in them into a language that the computer can understand. For example, we might want to take the inverse square root of 7, and then turn it into a bunch of zeros and ones. The problem with this floating point system is that it's fairly demanding on hardware. It's more expensive to divide than it is to add and subtract, and if a game is doing this kind of calculation behind the scenes, it would take up a lot of computational power that we could use to provide a smoother experience. So if we could find a way to make the same calculation in a less taxing way, even a minor improvement in performance would be huge if we had to run the computation thousands of times per second. So what does this code even do? Every surface on screen during typical gameplay is made from innumerable smaller segments, and each segment attempts to realistically light and shade as if it had a light source. As a result, a surface made of just 10 smaller segments performs the computation 10 times per frame, and at 30 frames per second. Now do this computation tens or hundreds of thousands of times per second for all the visible surfaces on the screen, and you may run into some performance issues. Quake used the fast inverse square root to approximate within 0.001% the value that would be given by the original computation, but did it in a way that was much less resource intensive. This alternative algorithm in Quake 3 didn't divide or deal with exponents. In fact, it just shifted bits one space to the right and subtracted using a constant. The result is then run through an estimation method first developed by Isaac Newton, and the final value is indistinguishable from the one that would be given by doing a more expensive computation. In other words, the algorithm finds the inverse square root in a completely different way, and is still 99.99% accurate. In fact, this computation was 4 times faster than traditional floating point division, so each of the tens or hundreds of thousands of operations done per frame would be 4 times more efficient, freeing up resources for other parts of the game. It's as if you were hired to map out an undiscovered piece of land all by yourself, but then 3 of your friends offered to help you. You'd explore the land 4 times faster, and the time you saved by not going around all alone would allow you to finish the map sooner. The origin of this magical constant in the algorithm remains a mystery, but this is probably its first use in gaming. The developers could have simply removed all lighting and shading that wasn't strictly necessary, but instead, they used an alternative that could preserve graphical quality. This sounds awfully familiar to the philosophy of Naughty Dog, biting off more than you can chew and then working out a way to make it possible, rather than just setting your sights low. However, Quake 3's solution wasn't complicated by comparison. In fact, it's deceptively simple but equally effective. Now, I'm not a math person, so please excuse the rather vague explanations that I've given here. A comprehensive explanation is available on Wikipedia and many other websites. Another huge problem for hardware is loading. Most games require a certain amount of load time, during which the player cannot interact with the world. For as long as there have been loading screens, games have tried their hand at masking them in creative ways. You might recall Mass Effect's unnaturally long elevator shafts. Then developers added party dialogue and radio broadcasts during these elevator rides, which was a really clever way of keeping the player's attention and adding some depth to the world. The Metroid Prime series used a long, narrow corridor to load the game behind the scenes, with no explicit mention to the player. Skyrim and Dragon Age take advantage of the loading screen to present a snippet about the world's lore, such as enemy design or NPCs, and you can even rotate and zoom in on Skyrim's monsters. Dead Space loaded its rooms while the player was waiting for a door to unlock. This meant that each door took a slightly different amount of time to open, but given that the game's horror atmosphere created tension with every new room, this turned out to be a great way to circumvent loading and generate suspense. Other games may have had a completely interactable loading screen. Namco has used minigames in their load screens for decades as a way to keep the player interacting with the game, instead of idly watching a progress bar. EA Sports titles allow for warm-up sessions during the loading, which lets players practice their soccer or basketball skills even before the game has begun. So just how important is hardware limitation? We mentioned it in a previous Longform, but recall that the Nintendo Entertainment System had an 8-bit microprocessor with only 2 kilobytes of RAM. Developers needed to design graphics with easily discernible layers for objects and characters in a resolution of 256 by 240. Shigeru Miyamoto, who created Mario, apparently once told an interviewer that the NES was not capable of displaying both Mario and Yoshi together at any time, which is why we had to wait until Super Mario World for the SNES to see our favorite green dinosaur. But many other aspects of the NES's hardware limitations are still apparent in his work. In the 1981 title Donkey Kong, the very first cutscenes in game history were made from the game's existing assets. And while it seems kind of obvious, this clever use of recycled assets raises the bar for other developers to make their own cutscenes. Let's consider the music from Super Mario Bros. 1's first level. The drum and percussion noises in this track are actually formed from chopped up pieces of white noise. Koji Kondo, the game's composer, was limited to just 3 musical channels, but he also had access to a single white noise channel. By manipulating what might otherwise be considered a useless audio channel, he and many other NES-era composers produced innovative music. Now think of a track from a modern title like Dragon Age or Call of Duty. It's probably more complex in its design. To hear this track in your mind, you probably have to think of many different instruments, strings, brass, percussion, and voices, all interacting at the same time. In about 30 years, we've gone from chiptune to orchestral, and this striking contrast reminds us of the rapid pace of change in gaming. Most game series, including Mario, have switched to live performance recording to produce their game soundtracks. And while sound quality has greatly improved as a result, live music is not without its own limitations. The largest chamber orchestra in the world can't make the iconic Mario Bros. Theme without translating its voices into string or brass. In fact, many of today's soundtracks would sound just as good if they were part of a film score, which is a blessing and a curse. What we gain in scale, quality, and dynamics, we lose in uniqueness. And ironically, a human orchestra can never hope to replicate the tight rhythm and insanely fast tempo of a track like Battle on the Big Bridge from Final Fantasy V. So in short, it's difficult to make a 30-musician orchestra sound so simple that its melodies can be played on NES hardware, and vice versa, without extensive modification. The NES did a lot with its simple hardware. Each beat had to be carefully placed in a game's tracks, because there was hardly any room at all for inefficiency. Each of the 3 musical audio channels had to be used with maximum value, and a lot of work went into tuning these channels to produce an acceptable track. Each passage of a track would probably use audio channels in a creative way, or at the very least, in a way that made coherent music, even with such strict limitations. With so little to work with, composers focused on simple, catchy melodies. Personally, I find older game music to be more memorable for this reason, although nostalgia and repetition certainly influence my opinion. If you can't have a sweeping orchestral piece, you might as well try for something that's catchy and unique. Composers were therefore forced to be creative in making soundtracks. More current hardware allows for much broader strokes and can impart a huge number of emotional subtleties into games. The high value of the NES's 3 audio channels made for good music, and some themes still persist in the industry today. In fact, music on the NES hardware is so iconic that an entire genre of chiptune music is now widely popular. The next game generation traded sprites for polygons and shading, and pushed graphics into 3 dimensions. One of the most clever and useful innovations here was the pre-rendered background. A pre-rendered static background could create the illusion of 3-dimensionality without being taxing on hardware, and only important objects needed to be rendered in 3D. This was used to great effect in the original Resident Evil, as well as its enhanced GameCube remake. Of course, pre-rendered backgrounds are static and unresponsive to play, and the angle of view cannot be easily changed. Even though they have their own limitations, pre-rendered backgrounds provided just enough leeway for some older games to greatly improve aesthetically. Final Fantasy has used this technique to great effect on the PlayStation, allowing for seamless transition between gameplay and cutscene, which amplifies the cinematic effects of these games. On the SNES, pre-rendering was used to snapshot the playable characters for the Donkey Kong Country series. These snapshots were then imported as 2D sprites into the game, providing unique and, for the time, highly detailed character models. Here's a really interesting and clever workaround for graphics. The PlayStation 3 title Wipeout HD renders at 1080p most of the time. Without a creative adjustment, the game might suffer from dips in frame rate and graphical glitches. The developers used a technique that permits a dynamic resolution in-game. The resolution of the game can be changed frame by frame so that the overall experience feels smooth and seamless, and since these changes occur within a 30th of a second, they're much less intrusive to the player than a dropped frame here and there. These simple examples of progression in audio and video are the low-hanging fruit of clever solutions. They're pretty much inevitable as better hardware allows for more complexity, but we could make a huge list of the creative changes in games because of any console's limitations. We can see here that problem-solving in games is generally possible, even when it appears otherwise. The complexity and size of game engines and mechanics are a huge double-edged sword. The optimal path to solve a problem may not always be immediately available. Maybe the source isn't actually what it seems, or a tentative solution interacts unpredictably with other mechanics, but the vast array of potential solutions with which we can try and experiment are similarly inflated because of the variety of the game's system. Problematic or taxing graphics can be improved by changing the behavior of light, rendering an object in variable quality depending on the distance, or changing the resolution only when the player can't tell. Just as there are countless ways that a problem can arise, there are countless ways that you can go about solving it. So even though limitation is a normal part of game development, it's not nearly as important a factor as you may discover. Hardware specifications are a garden that encloses your game, but you have the freedom to decide exactly how to grow it. So instead of hard barriers, these limitations almost beg to be bypassed and manipulated through careful planning and critical thinking. Now let's get a little conceptual. Difficulty. Game difficulty is a challenge, for any designer because it has so many working parts. It has to challenge the player, but not alienate them. It has to be lenient, but not a pushover. In short, it has to produce flow, a state bestowed on a player when the game is correctly balanced and engrossing. The ideal game will exactly match a player's ability dynamically, adjusting as the player becomes better and better. While most games use some kind of opaque difficulty selection, opting for the more creative solution can be a tremendously rewarding experience for the player. Dark Souls 2 does this well. If the game is not challenging enough to keep pace with the player's abilities, the player can use an item to raise the difficulty of an area. If the game is too difficult for the player, he or she can invite a friend to join their game world so that they can progress cooperatively. These solutions are more creative than a simple difficulty menu because they allow for easily predictable results, which helps to maintain flow. I don't know what the difference is between normal and hard modes before I start a game, but I know that having another human player in my game makes any scenario a bit easier, so the difficulty is selective to the player. When you don't pay attention to game and player flow, it's easy to lose the player. When a static difficulty just won't do to appeal to a large group of potential customers, it pays to give the player more control over the game's challenge. Game designers have tried their best to prevent the disruption of flow through difficulty, and the ways that a game can be tweaked during gameplay are nearly unlimited. Older games tended to have discrete, opaque difficulty settings that were set in stone. Instead of a simple 3-tiered difficulty menu that's locked down once you start a game, today's games may adjust dynamically as you play. Resident Evil 4 and 5 both scale their difficulty downward if you die too much. Some RPGs, like Bravely Default, allow you to turn off random encounters entirely, or disable money and item drops for more challenge. Most competitive games try to match you with other players of similar skill level, like Hearthstone, or similar character level, like in Diablo 3 or Dark Souls. In the Mario Kart series, a player in last place is much more likely to get a powerful item than any other racer, and for players that are very skilled, the often reviled rubber banding system was implemented. If a player gains a substantial lead while in first place, computer-controlled racers receive a noticeable increase in speed, so that the AI can catch up. Rubber banding enables the AI to always be within close proximity to the player, no matter their skill level. Fallout 3 and The World Ends With You both employ a difficulty slider, so that literally anyone can find the correct level of challenge for them. Rewards scale with difficulty, of course, but the option to change difficulty anytime means that each player has a concrete goal to work towards. This might be the option with the widest possible application, and it can also show up not as a slider, but as part of the game's design. For example, Super Mario Galaxy relies on subjective difficulty by giving the player a goal with several possible routes to reach it. Each path offers a different level of challenge, which becomes built into the level design of the game itself. This is certainly more subtle than a difficulty slider, but its range of challenge is relatively narrow as a result. Either option is good for promoting smooth flow because you're given a position along a spectrum and explicitly shown the peak of difficulty that you'll eventually work towards. Subjective difficulty is also harder to implement because it's not simple numbers tweaking. The game has to be designed with this concept in mind. Furthermore, older games sometimes have a time limit, whereas many newer games are more focused on allowing you to explore. Games with restrictions like a timer are less suited for subjective difficulty, because the game clock can only be balanced for one out of possibly thousands of different difficulty settings. Sure, it might work for a small proportion of the gamers that pick up the game, but its static nature can be problematic for anyone outside of the median skill level. Another option is to let players determine the difficulty of their games independently of difficulty settings, more commonly called self-imposed challenge. The Legend of Zelda series has a 3-heart challenge, or you might try to complete Final Fantasy VII without using any materia. A really interesting challenge is the Nuzlocke challenge in the Pokemon series. You can only catch the first Pokemon you encounter in an area, and if any of your Pokemon faint in battle, you can never use them again. The variables for a self-imposed run are limitless, and could include limitation of upgrades, ability usage, taking damage, dealing damage, or completing a game at the lowest possible character level. If The Legend of Zelda automatically gave you another heart to add to your life counter, the 3-heart challenge wouldn't really be possible. For most games, there's always some variable that the player can control to create a challenge, but the broader the mechanics are, the more options the player has, and ultimately, the player will spend more time and get more out of a game they spent hard-earned money on. But there is one challenge that 99% of all games ever made can be played with, and that's the speedrun. We could devote an entire long-form analysis to the history and complexities of speedrunning, but suffice it to say that it's the most widely popular challenge run in gaming. If you've ever watched Games Done Quick's week-long gaming speedrun marathons, you've seen that challenge runs can not only bring gamers together in friendly competition, but can also unite them in working towards a common goal. To date, the marathon has raised nearly $3 million for charities like Doctors Without Borders and the Prevent Cancer Foundation. If you haven't seen GDQ's gaming marathons, then you should use up all your vacation days and stay at home like a cretin and watch, because in my opinion, it's one of the greatest gaming events of the year. Although it appears static, game difficulty is perhaps one of the most malleable mechanics a game can offer. The traditional 3-tier difficulty setting becomes less and less frequently used as new games come out, because the gradual shift from challenge to exploration in games over the last few decades is more appropriately served by wide-ranging and dynamic challenge that can fit the skills of almost any player. As long as developers can maintain flow throughout the game, their particular difficulty system is irrelevant, but giving players more options is almost always a good thing. Everything we've mentioned here is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to finding intelligent ways to solve problems in game design. Every video game is an unfathomably complex interaction between player skill and developer vision, between risk and reward, between challenge and exploration, and between game hardware and game mechanics. A bird's-eye view of well-implemented solutions lets us see just how much hard work and dedication go into making these games that we enjoy. The innovations we've discussed here highlight the take-home message for game developers. Even if your hardware isn't as powerful as you want, or the game isn't as challenging as you want, you still have the tools to solve any and all problems, no matter how monumental they may seem. Each clever solution is a step towards engaging players while simultaneously removing design barriers, and the end product is one step closer to realizing its true potential.